You're listening to Dating After DV. Real stories, expert insights, and deep healing from women who've been there. Together, we're breaking the silence, naming the patterns, and rising from toxic to true love. You're not starting over, you're starting stronger. With me, your host, Christy. Welcome back to Dating After DV. Today we have with us Brandon, a detective in Colorado. Brandon, thanks for being with us today.
Absolutely, Christy. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to have this conversation. Just a little bit about my background. I've been in law enforcement for nearing 13 years. I've spent about half that time as a domestic violence investigator, detective. I have run 2 domestic violence high-risk teams, so a multidisciplinary group of folks that seek to prevent intimate partner homicide. And I teach on the topic around the country. I've been fortunate enough to go all over the country and teach other law enforcement officers, teach advocates, teach prosecutors, really just how we can come together and serve folks being victimized in intimate relationships.
First of all, thank you for your service. Thank you for what you do. There's certainly not enough education going on. What do you think law enforcement doesn't necessarily see about high-risk DV situations that you most commonly educate about?
Yeah, so I would say the number one issue, and it's unfortunate, right? Because there are people who have been in this space for 40 plus years who are champions of intimate partner violence, teaching and education. And what I found the most when teaching is the lack of understanding of why someone would stay. That age-old question of why doesn't she just leave? Unfortunately, law enforcement officers around the country are still asking themselves that question. And I can tell you, right, I'll raise my hand and admit my own faults. Early in my career, I thought by virtue of the fact that I showed up at an intimate partner violence call, I arrested who I determined to be the offender, that thereby I was instantly making things better, that I had arrested the person who committed the crime and restored all hope and dignity to the survivor. But I really didn't understand that all I was doing was intervening at a very small piece of the timeline, right? There's often years, months before, there's years, months after. And really all I've done as a law enforcement officer, not with malice or with intention, but really I've come into this relationship and turned it on its head. And oftentimes that's not even what the survivor wanted. All the while, I think law enforcement's response to intimate partner violence is critical, right? I think we are a key part of the model, but I also think we need to better understand reasons that a survivor in that situation wouldn't just up and leave, right? It's not that simple. And I think I could spend the rest of my time on this earth, Christy, just doing education on that topic alone.
First of all, I'm so moved. Actually, I'm like, wow, just hearing what you're saying and the work that you're doing has me with a lump in my throat. And there's lots of reasons why people don't leave. I think a lot of people think, I could never be a battered woman, or I could fix this, just leave it alone. Not to mention the blow up that happens once police are involved. You said a lot of times it's not even what the victim wanted. And of course, that's understandable. What would you say are some of these barriers to reporting?
Yeah, so the barriers to reporting to law enforcement are really voluminous. Again, that's a topic that we could spend the rest of today discussing. One, and I never want to miss an opportunity to talk about this, is one of the biggest barriers to reporting and or leaving is love.
Yeah.
Right? And that's not something that as a society, even I think we acknowledge enough, is that just because you're abused by a person doesn't mean you don't love them. And I think we've come to understand that relative to children who are abused by their parents, but we don't get it when it relates to intimate partner violence. And we can talk about financial barriers. We can talk about them not wanting to get their partner in trouble, them not wanting to face retaliation for their partner getting in trouble. But really, when we gloss over the fact that they still love their partner, that I think we're missing the human element of intimate partner violence. And Chrissy, it's the most commonly perpetrated crime against a person in our society. A crime against a person, nothing is committed more than intimate partner violence. I had an investigation recently, and I was listening to the jail calls of the offender. And he was talking to another person, and he kept going on and saying that this is between she and I. What happens in our house is our business, and that law enforcement shouldn't be involved, that she shouldn't be talking about things that occur inside the home. And I just found that it's not groundbreaking, right? It's not a shock that folks who use violence against their partners feel as though there's this cloak of coverage for them to really do whatever it is that they want. And so by the time a situation like this gets brought to the light and law enforcement's involved, if we don't look beyond just what happened today, we have to stop responding to these with blinders on, not taking into account the years that happened before it. Because if we don't try to understand that, we're never going to be able to help the survivor. And on the topic of barriers to reporting, one thing I wish that as a profession we would do a little bit more, and I like to say it in this specific way, is give survivors options, not dilemmas. So we shouldn't be arriving on a scene and saying, hey, Christy, this is really dangerous. You need to leave. I'm telling you, you need to leave. Or, hey, separate for the night. That's something that law enforcement has said forever. We need to give you options, not dilemmas. Hey, here's the number to the local DV service agency. Do you have a friend we could call? Do you want to call? Is there a safe person that you want to involve in this conversation? And so it just really, again, comes down to options, not dilemmas.
What is it that has brought you to this level of awareness as a law enforcement detective? Was it your research? Was it your experience? I don't hear a lot of people in your position speaking about things with this level of understanding of the cycle of abuse and what happens afterward.
Sure. So yeah, I'll share a little bit about how I got here, my why. When I was a child, my mother was involved in several relationships where her partner was abusive to her. I didn't know who my father was. And then it was just this cycle of men who, used various levels of intimate partner violence against my mom. And even then, right, once I got sent and lived with another family member and my life trajectory sort of changed, I never contemplated getting into law enforcement. That wasn't something I had ever planned. In high school, I wanted to be a politician. I was going to be a political science major. So fast forward to college, I'd become a political science major. And it's my junior year of college that I was put in a situation in which I could go on a ride along with a police officer that I knew, or I could go shopping with my then girlfriend and her friend at Target for the day.
Great.
So I was at a pivotal fork in the road, and I chose to go on the ride along, not really knowing what it would be, not really, really having any comprehension of the field. And I went out there and I did 10 hours. And by the end of that day, I was hooked. I knew that law enforcement is what I wanted to do, but I still hadn't connected it back to the experiences of my childhood. And so fast forward, I get hired by a police agency and I'm sitting in the police academy in the great state of Montana. And the topic of intimate partner violence is covered. And I just remember sitting there and it was like a wave came over me, right? And because I had often wondered as a young adult why my mom had done the things that she had done, right? Why had she stayed? Why had she, done all the things that she did? And up until that point, I'll be honest with you, I blamed my mom for a lot of things.
Sure.
I blamed her for us going days without eating. And I blamed her for just really my plight in life. I believed that she was the root cause. And when I started to understand DV just even a little bit, I started to understand that it wasn't her fault. She made poor choices. And sometimes survivors dealing with trauma and all these things, that they do make poor choices.
Yeah.
But it's not because they want to. It's not because they woke up one day and was like, hey, I think I'm going to be a victim. And then I'm going to get drug addicted and I'm going to get alcohol addicted and I'm going to do all these things because I want to. No one wants to do those things. So then I'm sitting in the academy and I'm hearing all this and I'm thinking like I could really help folks in this situation because all the while I'd never been a victim of intimate partner violence. I had certainly watched it.
Yeah.
And so, that kind of set me on my course. And then I knew I've always been victim centered before being victim centered was even really a thing that was talked about. And I don't know why. I can't really tell you why, but that's just always how I've done this work. And so then fast forward, I started going to some trainings. Russell Strand, who's probably my biggest mentor in the law enforcement space. I went to FETI, Forensic Experiential Trauma Interview. Right around the same time, I became a child forensic interviewer. And I just put those things together and started to understand trauma. I think that's the root of it, Christy, really, is obviously there's education, right, on the cycles of abuse and things of that nature. But you can go to 15 of those trainings, but if you don't really understand trauma, none of that's going to sink in. And so really, I think that's the key component is when I started to understand trauma. And that really began with Russ Strand, then moving on to other giants in the field like Mark Wynn, Rita Smith, these folks that have gotten it for 40 years. In that moment, I knew what I needed to do. I love this profession. I think there's nothing on earth more noble than policing. However, we've got a long way to go often I wonder to myself, is it that cops don't care, or is it they just don't get the specific training that they need to understand the situations they face? Like a classic example I'll give you is we train on firearms, defensive tactics, driving all the time. It's required education, and it should be. If we're entrusted with those things, we should know how to use them and use them appropriately. When do we get ongoing training about trauma and domestic violence? When is there in-service training relative to those things? And it's interesting when I talk to certain police executives having this conversation, we train on firearms. Why do we do so? It's a low frequency, high risk situation, right? We have to be competent. We have to be able to protect the public. Now let's look at domestic violence. It's high frequency and it's high risk, right? So it's both. And yet where's our training on that topic? Or where are we investing our time as a profession? I'm not talking about any one police agency. Really, I'm talking about policing around the world. I'm incapable of giving a short answer to a question, as you've now seen. I hope I answered your question. I think how I got here really is, I don't know, but I'm grateful to be here. And there's nothing I love more than advancing the profession so that it can better serve survivors.
Thank you again. You talk about trauma. Where do you see understanding trauma being the root of understanding the cycle of abuse?
Absolutely. So what I would say on that, the short answer, I'll try to give you one, is when we look, right, from a perspective of someone who hasn't been victimized, someone who comes home to a happy environment, right, all the bills are paid, everything's good. And we look at that survivor who the day after their offender is arrested is the one picking them up from jail once they get their PR bond. There is no real logic in that unless you understand trauma, unless you understand that that's survival for that person. Because if they're not there to pick up their partner once they're released from jail, God help them.
Yeah.
And so to the person at the grocery store or the person on a jury, right? And that's again, a whole nother topic, but
Yeah.
the folks, to include law enforcement, who don't understand why they go back and why they make the decisions they make. And you can't understand those things unless you understand trauma. But understanding that trauma fundamentally changes the brain. It fundamentally alters brain chemistry. And so when you're in fight or flight, and that's honestly a term that I am understanding is folks are going away from.
Yeah.
But let's just say you're in a situation in which you're facing high levels of danger or high fear, right? Your cortisol is increasing. You start to begin to think with your primitive brain, right? As opposed to your thinking brain.
Yeah.
Because your brain is overwhelmed and chemically and physically, you're unable to have, I don't want to say rational thought, but it's not the same decision as I'm at the grocery store and do I want chicken or beef for dinner?
Right.
But I think we tend as a society to put, does she stay or does she leave in the same box of, do we want chicken or beef for dinner? And we just have to understand that that's not possible.
From what I've seen, I mean, I started this project hoping to hear from both men and women or any gender that identifies as a survivor or a victim in the past. What I'm seeing is it is quite gendered, of course, and we could have surmised that, but I've seen some more like female on male abuse in my time. And so that's where I was interested in having a bit of an edge with this project, but it's been hard to find men to speak up, right? And what I've come to realize is that men see this completely differently. You're being beat by someone who's smaller than you. That's a completely different thing than being a woman of smaller size, you know. So what have you seen in that sense in the field?
Yeah. So what I would say to that is, again, there's a lot of societal constructs around that. I remember being a little kid and my great grandfather telling me, men don't cry, build a bridge and get over it. And he was a World War II veteran, an incredible man, but he was a product of his environment.
Yeah.
And really emotion wasn't something that was baked into the equation. I think it's generational. I think there's societal constructs. What I'll tell you though, is in my community, so we administer lethality assessment. We use the danger assessment for law enforcement. That's from the Geiger Institute based on the work of Dr. Jacqueline Campbell. And we've been administering it now for 7 or 8 months. We brought it to the community. It's been really a game changer. When we get those lethality assessments, right, we track the data meticulously. And what we've seen in our community is it's about 70-30. So about 70% of our victims that we administer lethality assessment with are female and about 30% are male. And that's a higher number, right? Than I think a lot of communities are experiencing. or at least that the data is showing.
Yes.
What I found, though, layered within that is, so victims, right, they have the option to decline this assessment. They don't have to answer the questions. They don't have to participate. The victim decline is much higher in the male population than it is the female population.
Mm.
And so I think I don't think that's surprising. I think to your point, I don't think it's surprising, but I think we could do a much better job also as a profession of understanding, because we have these constructs too. Throughout my career, every time I teach, I give a disclaimer at the beginning that you're going to hear me say she and her and this a lot, because the data supports that women are victimized more frequently by intimate partners than they are offenders. And that is true, but that plants a seed, right, in our minds. And it's interesting when we go on calls, and I've had to fight this throughout my career, where my immediate supposition is that the female is the victim.
Yeah.
And that's coming from someone who has all the training and trains other people to do the work. So I think it's something that I'm conscious about combating within myself, within our high-risk team, within our agency. The other thing to your question is the engagement with services. So my belief is more important than law enforcement involvement is a survivor's engagement with confidential advocacy. And so what we've seen also with our team is men are far less likely to have long-term engagement with advocacy than are women. And again, I think the why behind that is all the things we've already talked about. I think it's come a long way, right? Even in my 13 years in policing, I think we have come a long way for service of male victims, but we certainly have a long way to go.
So when you come on the scene, you have that presupposition that it's the woman that's the victim, but is there anything that you can instantly see that you make that decision based off of? Is there any cues that you notice in the family dynamic or what has happened on the scene?
So I think that comes down to the individual state and their laws, right? So for example, here in Colorado, we have the predominant aggressor law, which allows us to look beyond what just happened tonight, right? Predominant aggressor doesn't just mean in tonight's situation. It means context, right? It means what we know about the history of the relationship. And so there's nothing necessarily that I know going on scene, unless, of course, I've interfaced with this couple before. But really, it's more about how much time do we spend on scene trying to get it right. And I think that is the most critical component, because you'll hear from police officers around the country that we don't have time. There's calls impending. We need to find out what happened, and then we need to go to the next call. And while I can appreciate, right, that calls impending need to be handled, this is the type of call we have to slow down on. We have to do more of a thorough investigation, and we have to take the blinders off. That's why I think the use of lethality assessment tools by law enforcement is so critically important, because it asks questions of the survivor that a patrol officer just typically isn't going to ask. Good example of, we're administering a lethality assessment. We're there for a physical assault. And one of the questions is, has your partner ever tried to kill you? And the victim says, oh yeah, and turns around and points to a spot on the wall where a bullet went over her head. But when we're talking about today, not even the victim is thinking about that. Why aren't they? Because we're asking them about today. And when they start to tell us more about something that happened before, we bring them back, right? We put guardrails on our interviews and our investigations, and there's no reason to do that, particularly in the case of intimate partner violence. So to answer your question, obviously determining predominant aggressor is going to come down to state by state law. But what I would say is start big and go small relative to the investigation, because there really isn't anything that's not important.
Yeah. And even outside of the police departments in the legal sphere, and in my case, they were dealing on it incident by incident, like incident basis. And even when I try to say this happened to before, and they're like, it doesn't matter, like we're dealing with this incident. And I'm like, but it does. It's a pattern. And even with the whole Diddy and Cassie case that's coming out, we're finally recognizing coercive control in the courtrooms.
So I wouldn't say that it's come out explicitly as being stated coercive control. What I would say, though, is most states already have laws that address that. It just is, for example, in Colorado, domestic violence is not a standalone crime. Domestic violence is a sentence enhancer that can be attached to any crime committed amongst intimate partners. The prongs to meet domestic violence sentence enhancer is punishment, revenge, intimidation, coercion, or control. So before coercive control really came onto the map, and grateful it has, don't get me wrong, But there were already laws to address that. We just weren't doing it. There's plenty of opportunity to address coercive control, even within existing laws.
Mm.
So it is an element of every intimate partner violence investigation. It really is. And, what I've found, I guess the most disheartening is when we do an investigation and we're asking questions and the victim tells us that he's never hit me.
Yeah.
For law enforcement, that typically is the end of the road. That's where we say, we're writing this report for informational purposes. Call us back if he hits you. And man, we're missing so much opportunity. And if our stated goal as a profession is to prevent harm to the folks that we serve, we have got to dispel this notion that domestic violence has to be physical for it to be a crime. It is so far from reality, because we also understand, or at least some of us understand, that the vast majority of intimate partner violence is not physical. And we want to get it before it becomes that. The whole reason that high risk teams exist are to intervene at a misdemeanor level, right? At a low level, so that we don't get to the homicide. But if we're missing this because it's going to become physical, right? It is going to become physical. It doesn't get better. It is one of those things that I think, again, we're kidding ourselves as a profession if we say, why don't you go stay at your mom's for the night and cooler heads will prevail. This is just not how that works. And so it's critically important for us to utilize that coercion and control as part of our investigation, because really that's the bedrock of all intimate partner violence is power and control.
There's a lot of confusion from within that moment. So let's say you're talking to, and this is someone like a friend of yours. They're saying, he's never hit me or she's never hit me. What's your response to get them to see what this can turn into?
So what I would say is I would start from the beginning. I would say, tell me more about how you met. And let's talk about the first, 6-8 months where things were really good. And they're going to get to that point where we're starting to get to that critical point in the timeline. And they probably are going to be hesitant to talk about it, which makes total sense. And then I'm going to say something like, tell me more about when it went bad. And bad does not mean physical, right? It can, but it doesn't exclusively mean physical. And so what I would say to a person in that circumstance, whether it be a friend, a family member, a survivor that I'm talking to because of my work, is tell me about your experience. It's not about an event. It's not about a moment in time. It's about the experience. And I find that, like I mentioned earlier, when we start big and go small, they will identify their own recognition of things that are problematic. It's not for me to tell them, right? Because for you and I, a certain act might be problematic for me and not for you in a relationship, right? And so I'm not being prescriptive. I'm not being legislative about, hey, if this is happening, then this, right? It's just telling more about your experience. And honestly, and I don't know what your experience is, and you don't have to share, but what I found doing this work is the most powerful thing that anyone can do when they're talking to someone who's a victim of intimate partner violence is support and listen. That is the number two things that a person should do, because it's not like other situations, right? Let's use the example of a parent and their kid, and the parent says, hey, if you go out and get one more speeding ticket, I'm taking away your car, right? That's something that happens frequently, I assume. You can't do that in intimate partner violence, right? If you give them ultimatums, you're going to push them away, and then they're not going to talk to you. You have to keep an open line, a safe open line, because telling them, hey, you leave this relationship or we're done, I can't communicate with you anymore, that doesn't help. This is not a situation in which that sort of, tough love is applicable.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned the 6 to 8 months. That's really for myself when I got clear. It was like there was a shove at 6 months and I ended up packing my stuff, going home. And that's what my dad said. He's like, it doesn't get better. And there was love. And by the time I did go to the police, a lot of things that you're saying are having me reminisce on that conversation. And I was so grateful for the police in my hometown in Canada, where I'm bawling and I'm telling and I'm trying to like explain myself and why I didn't come to the police yet. And I was so blessed to have someone who understood. And he, like you said, he listened, he supported, and he would even say things like, that's what he's counting on. Like he's counting on you not. And I was just like, Oh man, I was relieved to have someone who is educated in this stuff. I give you a huge round of applause again for the work that you do. Thank you. Please don't stop. We are, from what I can see, quite far away from this being where it could and where it needs to be. What can victims do in terms of preparing, whether they're the ones that report or whether it is a neighbor or someone else? What are your tips on documentation, what not to do, what to do, priorities?
Sure. So the number one thing I would recommend to folks who are experiencing intimate partner violence is documentation, right? Because, and you said it when you were sharing your experience about the police get there and you're sobbing, you're apologizing for things you shouldn't be apologizing for. You're not going to be able in that moment to provide, here's an example. One of the biggest mistakes we make as it relates to interviewing is we say, start at the beginning and go to the very end and tell me everything that happened. That's the least trauma-informed way that you can conduct an interview, yet we do it every single day. What can be so helpful for survivors and is keeping documentation in a way that's safe. So I've worked with some incredible survivors, women who, I don't know how they get out of bed every day. Their intimate partner holds them at gunpoint routinely. They do all these things and they keep, there's one case I've had where there was a 75-page log, right, of 3 years worth of abusive behavior. And when she was ready to report, and for the first 3 years, she was not.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
When she felt safe to report, she in essence wrote the arrest warrant. It was just us copying and pasting from all of her documentation. Video. A survivor can get some kind of an application on their phone where they can secretly record. Home surveillance cameras. You would be shocked, Christy, how often domestic violence offenders abuse their partners on home surveillance. And they don't even try to get rid of it because to the officer's point, when they said that to you, is they count on that victim not reporting, right? It's happened so long and for so many years or months or whatever that they just get to the point where they believe there's no way that their partner is ever going to report them.
Mm-hmm.
And the documentation via written, via typed out, surveillance, if there's any sort of way to privately record. There's an incredible app that came out. It's called My eBodyguard. Melissa Faith Hart is the CEO of that company. And, they have a digital cloud, right? A way to store your own evidence so that it can be transmitted to the police in real time. There are things out there. Amy Says is Ann Wittemute. She runs Amy Says. And it's an AI platform that can help talk you through, hey, Amy, I'm experiencing this. What am I facing? There's so much out there for survivors. And I would say that documentation is probably the best thing you can do if you do plan to ultimately report to the police. Because when we get there in the moment of trauma, it's called trauma brain, right? And I say, Christy, tell me everything that happened from the beginning to the end. Don't leave anything out. What the hell am I doing? Right? That's horrific. Why would I expect someone experiencing a trauma to do that? I can't even tell you what I've done all day today from the beginning to the end with any degree of certainty. And yet we're expecting that of folks who are victims. And so that would be my top recommendation. Secondly, would be report when you think it's safe, right? Survivors are the experts of their own experience, not the police, right? Or not the lawyer, not your mom, not your dad. You're the expert of your situation. And so when you feel as though, because here's what a survivor has to prepare for. They report to the police and the police don't find probable cause.
Yeah.
And now they're in the same home with their abusive partner. And now the abusive partner is emboldened even further because they've called the police and the police didn't do anything. And so that is I can't even imagine having to weigh that. Let's talk about another elephant in the room. Calling police is like spinning a roulette wheel. Fortunately, I heard you talk about that cop and how he treated you, how you were a human to him. This wasn't a transaction. This wasn't on to the next call. But that's not every police officer. And I think that's the other thing survivors face. And it goes beyond just the police response, right? Let's say that the survivor calls and law enforcement makes an arrest. That cop that you got did a great job. Now it goes to the detective, right? And is the detective trauma informed? Then it goes to the advocate. Is the advocate trauma informed? Then, okay, now we're preparing for court. What about the prosecutor? And now we're preparing for trial. What about the defense attorney? What's his sister going to say about you? There's just so many layers to the justice system that if a survivor can be as prepared as possible, and sometimes they can't be, right? But if they can be as prepared as possible, it'll make their interaction easier. One of the things I've found is even cops who aren't super trauma informed, they're good people. They just don't have the training. If a victim comes in with an itemized, hey, here's the dates and times that this all happened, and here's the videos that correspond, it's pretty self-explanatory. And so what I don't want folks to hear that are listening to this is that those things are required to get just service from the police, but it certainly helps. And it also helps the survivor when the police get there and they say, tell me everything that's happened to you. They can use that as like here's the things. If you want to ask me about each incident, we can go through it one incident at a time, but I can't tell you everything on a timeline. And so what I hope the survivors also hear is we shouldn't expect that of you. There's no reason that we should expect you to recall every detail from the beginning to the end in explicit detail. And so if you have that expectation of yourself as a survivor, please don't, because that's not how trauma works. That's not how the brain works. And that's perfectly okay.
Yeah, that's, again, you're bringing up things I've forgotten about. But there was a fear for me in going to the police. First of all, love what you said about I'm the expert of when I'm safe. And the reason I waited 2 months after the assault, so it's spring of 2023, and it wasn't until just shy of 2 months later that I actually reported because I was still working for him running his business. So of course, and then they're like, why didn't you report sooner? I'm like, first of all, I still work for him and this was my full-time thing and driving a company vehicle. And secondly, the thing that made me feel pushed to that point was he had started stalking, which I actually didn't believe at first. And then someone had confirmed indeed he was where he shouldn't have even known that I was. So that's kind of what freaked me out. But by the time I went to report, I was terrified that, let's say I get one detail wrong or I don't remember it. Are they going to throw out my entire thing and be like, you're unreliable or your character isn't right? So I was terrified of testifying too. It's like, they're just not going to believe me. I know he has an amazing lawyer and I certainly don't have that and I can't afford that. That means a lot. Thank you for putting it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really just distilling it down to humanity, right? It is really what it is. And understanding that constructs we've created for ourselves aren't constructs that other folks experience. And, that question of why didn't you report for 2 months? I want to talk about delayed disclosure, really help folks understand that that is so common and it makes perfect sense, right? Delayed disclosure, whether it's in sexual assault victimizations, whether it's in domestic violence, whether it's really any intimate crime, delayed disclosure is common. And in fact, it's really the rule and not the exception. Very rarely do folks report immediately after something happened. And there's a host of really good reasons. And honestly, those reasons are evidence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say that again. Why a survivor doesn't leave is actually evidence. If we as the police do a good enough job with our interview to get the why, to get the understanding. And I want to say this too, when we ask why, there's a negative connotation with that. And so when a person says, Christy, why didn't you just leave? Let me simply reframe that question into, Christy, tell me more about why you felt safe to report now. And that's a completely different, I'm asking the same thing.
Yep.
I'm just doing it in a completely different way. And I even had the word why in there, and that's okay. If it's framed around what made you feel safe to report this today?
Yeah.
It's that simple. Or what made you feel comfortable telling me today? Another simple thing is, hey, thanks for sharing your experience. Thank you for trusting me with your experience. And it's so simple. It's just human. It's just being a human.
Yeah. And yet, at least from where I'm from in Canada, so I report, but then I become the victim witness for the police to then charge. But I found that his lawyer, that was the biggest thing. And what the police were most like, we don't know what to say about why she waited 2 months. And the lawyer was saying, like, if it's true, why did she wait? So there seems to be this weight. It's devaluing or putting less credibility on someone if they do wait, and that can benefit the other side. Why is that?
Because again, it's a system that doesn't understand trauma. It's a system that doesn't understand intimate partner violence. It is a private attorney who doesn't really care what your experience is, right? They're being paid. And really that's what they care about.
Yeah.
They're not there to understand your experience. They're there to, frankly, to cast you in a bad light.
Yeah.
If the investigator, though, in that situation, or the prosecutor, or the whatever your circumstance was, if they would have said to you, Christy, tell me more about waiting. If you feel comfortable sharing, what would you have told them?
Yeah, I would have said, like, I was still working for him. So if I go to the police, first of all, I'm out of a job, like, for sure. Secondly, if I stay at my job, he's gonna make my job hell. So it's like, I still have bills coming out. I can't lose my job. And then I finally felt so unsafe about the stalking, and I had left my job. So, okay, I have nothing to lose now. And he's stalking. It was like, now's the time. He can't get me any, like, he can try, but I'm gonna hide in my parents' basement. So that's what I would have said. And I did say that actually when I was testifying. He was trying to almost prompt me and say, okay, talk about why you're reporting now. I'm like, oh, like, I completely forgot I'm going back to the incident 2 months ago and being like, this happened and this happened. And then I'm also too being like, but I see how I caused this and I probably shouldn't have been yelling. And it's just, this is another thing where I'm like, am I showing you that
Yep.
I actually did cause this? So I was also terrified that's something that they're going to determine because I don't know who the prosecutor is. Maybe they'll be like, oh, she deserved it. That's what he's saying is going to happen anyway.
And that's what, like we talked about, that's why reporting is such roulette, because you don't know what you're going to get. You don't know, are you going to be on the stand? And is the prosecutor themselves going to be judging your decisions and your actions? And that's why it's all the more important that with law enforcement, we create that safe space for the survivor. Because if we ask the question on day one, right, I think there's this misconception that if we ask the question, we are judging the survivor. That's not it at all. It is, I want to put on the record your thought process so that the first time it's talked about is not in court. I want the prosecutor to hear from the first interview, Christy, tell me more about why you felt safe to report now, but you didn't 2 months ago. And then you tell me all those things. I can't lose my job. I have bills. I have obligations. That's evidence, Christy. And that makes perfect sense. And so I think oftentimes with law enforcement, we're afraid to explore the why behind the delayed disclosure. But really all we're doing when we don't explore that is hurting the survivor, because they don't know to tell us that.
Yeah.
That's not something, maybe they have it in the back of their head of that maybe they don't believe me because it's delayed. But not very often is a survivor going to front load with, hey, I waited 2 months to report and here's why.
Yeah.
That's very rare. And we shouldn't expect them to do that. We as competent, trauma-informed interviewers have to ask those questions.
Is there anything you would offer as tips for folks who they've reported it, they've documented, and now they're trying their best to be no contact? Maybe there is a peace bond or restraining order.
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. So again, I think that's, as a society, we misunderstand that once the charges have been filed, now, right, smooth sailing. We've done what we need to do, and now this magical justice system is going to solve everything. What we don't account for is the life that happens in between the arrest and the trial, or the life that happens between the trial and the end of their partner being on probation, or whatever it turns out to be. And we ask ourselves, like in law enforcement, this is something, I don't know if you hear this in Canada, but I've heard this from law enforcement officers in the country. They call it, in the United States, they call it a consent violation, right? So yeah, there's a protection order violation, but the victim is going along with it, right? The protected party is in the car with their abusive partner willingly, or they're engaging in electronic communication. We've referred to it as a consent violation, which is just outrageous. I can't even, sorry, that fires me up a little bit, but it's to your point, to your question. Let's ask ourselves, what would be some reasons that it makes sense for a survivor to engage with that person, even though there's a protection order in place? There are dozens of reasons that it makes sense. Oftentimes I hear from survivors that it's safer for me to be here because at least I can understand what's going to happen next, particularly with victims of stalking. And I'm sure that you experience this, is kind of that concept of the devil you know.
Yeah.
If you're in the environment and you can, to a degree, control the environment, it's relatively predictable. Now we're separated. And what we know based on the research is the most lethal time for a survivor is post-separation. Now let's add on to it the partners facing criminal charges. Did they lose their job because of their criminal charges? What other lethality factors are occurring in this criminal justice terrarium, as Russ Strand likes to call it? Why wouldn't they talk to their abusive partner? It's almost harder to explain when they don't, because it's safety. It's maintaining some level of contact so that they at least know when the next blow is going to come. And that makes total sense. That is absolutely, completely understandable if you just understand trauma and you just understand lethality factors alone. So when I think we throw that back on a survivor and call it a consent violation, my mind is blown. What that tells me about that cop is that they need to go do a different job. They just don't understand. They're unwilling to understand what it's like to be that person. And that's not what this work is about.
Yeah. In my case, I had the peace bond in Canada, the restraining order, and it was for a year. And I'm like, I know exactly when that day is that he's free to contact me or come down to Southern California where I am. I don't know. Especially in these cases, a lot of times they have what they call flying monkeys, people watching my Instagram about what I'm up to and reporting back. And that's just something you're constantly looking over your shoulder. Even I'm in a different country and I still am like, you hear so much about Ted Bundy stuff. It was always a nice guy, right? And then, oh, he snapped one day. But I think my own getting back in the gym, being around healthy people who defend me and who see me, that's helped a lot to create community that if something out of the blue, if he pops down here and makes an issue, I feel like I'm in a lot healthier place at this point, 2 years later, to handle it. And even some other people I've interviewed, they've been 10 years out and they still, whether it's having dreams and that's very common, but still even knowing that he's looking for them. Someone with a similar credit card name was contacted by this person. Is there anything we can do about that? Maybe we should be starting with reporting those things.
I wouldn't even say that I wouldn't confidently say that starting by reporting, because again, all the things we've talked about, reporting can make things much worse. What I would say is, and you hit the nail on the head, is creating normalcy, creating community, getting to a point where you understand that the things you feel and the fears you have are valid. Speaking to people who don't just, as someone with diagnosed PTSD, what I can tell you is, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you, but it doesn't just go away, right? The experience is over, but the ramifications are probably going to last me a lifetime. And it's not a matter of getting over it. It's not even a matter of getting past it. It's just a matter of getting to the point where you can regulate it. When I started in this profession, a police officer seeking mental health help was very scrutinized. It meant that you were broken and that you couldn't do the job anymore and you were a liability. Now, fast forward, the agency I work for has a psychologist on staff just for us to talk to. And that agency's had that since the 90s. They were way ahead of the curve. But just having someone to share that yoke with and understand that it's not yours to carry alone. And that really, we're all in it together. And if, I don't know if you listen to podcasts or not, but you have one. So I guess by virtue of that, you listen to your own. But his name's Dr. John Delani, and he has a podcast where people just call in with all problems that they're facing. And he's a psychologist and he just talks them through in any life problem they could be facing. And one thing he says a lot, he talks about who gets a vote and who doesn't. Every time someone has an opinion about your situation, ask yourself, does that person get a vote? Do I care what they have to say about my situation? And I found that incredibly helpful, not only for me, but for folks that I work with, is just if you're a survivor and you've escaped your abusive partner and your cousin's brother has a question and questions what you've done, you don't need to move all the way to California. Come on. It's not that big of a deal. That person doesn't get a vote, very simply put. And I just hope that survivors understand that they're bigger and better than their trauma. They will get there and they're going to be hosting podcasts, right? Look at you. This is incredible. It's so cool for me to do this work and to then sit virtually in a room with you. You've done it, right? You are the real deal. You faced it, you fought it, you beat it. And here you are, inspiring, I know, hundreds of people. Thank you for what you do. I think any chance we get to give that thanks back to a survivor is amazing. And so thanks for what you do. Thank you.
You're going to make me cry. It's a pleasure and an honor to be your partner, even just for this hour. And again, thank you for what you do. It's especially with police departments and the legal sphere of jurisdiction that you are in. People like me all over the place are very grateful. Thank you so much again. And thanks for your time today.
Absolutely. Have a good rest of your day, Christy.
You too.